Now, the success of Eurosceptic parties in the European parliamentary elections this week has certainly shaken parts of the continent. It's given European leaders plenty of food for thought. In fact, later this evening in Brussels, they'll all gather for dinner to chew over what it means for the EU and discuss just what appetite there is for reform. How many puns can we have in this introduction? Well, earlier, one of the big winners at the polls, the leader of the French National Front, Marine Le Pen, said she wants to throw out some of the EU's most high-profile policies, among them freedom of movement and a common currency. This is what she had to say.
Chacun le reconnaît, et c'est pourquoi notre score est si significatif à avancer non.
Our manifesto has been clear. It has no hidden objective. It expresses the strength of our convictions. It was a patriotic project. Every day we highlighted to the French people the questions we have about Europe. This is a national, genuine project for the French, and that will be the basis for the next elections.
Well, with me now is Nina Schick from Open Europe. That's an independent think tank campaigning for EU reform. Also Stefanie Bolzen, who's correspondent with Germany's Die Welt newspaper. And joining us from our studio in Paris, Ockrent, a leading commentator on French affairs. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. Christine, if I could start with you, because this is it's been talked about an earthquake by Marine Le Pen, but it's an earthquake in national terms as well as European terms.
Very much so. As you pointed out, there is indeed that Eurosceptic wave throughout the continent, but in France, as in Britain, it's really an earthquake for the mainstream political parties, which have been heavily disavowed, which is not the case in most other European countries. So not only do you have the French left in power, President Hollande, the lowest ever in terms of popularity in current political French history. The left is at its lowest ebb ever, and some people openly, some socialist MPs are openly questioning the president's ability to run again in 2017. You know, that's very French. You always have to sort of think of the next step. But there's also a terrible turmoil on the conservative side. The UMP political party, Jean-François Copé, who used to run it, has had to resign. He will officially resign in a couple of weeks. There are financial scandals which could bounce back onto Nicolas Sarkozy for illegal financing of his presidential campaign. Right. So the whole scene, and it's all bread and butter for Madame Le Pen, because she has, of course, been pointing out at the disarray of traditional politicians.
Indeed. So that is a very messy picture, I think it's fair to say, coming from France at the moment. Stefanie Bolzen, if I could ask you, we've got to get some positives for the pro-Europeans, I suppose. It is, from Angela Merkel's perspective in Germany, not such a bad result.
No, it has been actually, Germany has been a kind of an oasis in this turmoil that we have seen on Sunday night, Monday morning.
What do you put that down to then?
I think Germans are pretty content with the government. They are very happy with Angela Merkel, how she has managed the euro crisis. But you must not forget there has been a new party that got 7%, the so-called Alternative für Deutschland, and they are highly Euro, not EU, but Eurosceptic.
Nina Schick, they are a relatively small party still, but they've made their mark here. I guess you're applauding them for that. And the talk is now about reform, major reform. What sort of reform? How far should the European Union leaders be thinking of acting?
Well, I think the top line on these elections is that it's pretty much a damning indictment of the EU status quo. So voters have always been presented between this choice of more Europe or breaking up the EU completely, but there has to be a middle ground. Europe has to reform.
But what is reform? Just tell me what that means in a nutshell.
So Brussels should focus on the big questions, things that the EU is good at. Trade, for example, pursuing that TTIP agreement with the US, making sure that Europe is globally competitive and able to compete with countries such as China, India, and not regulating the size of toilet flushes.
Right, that's operating on the big picture, on the international stage. What about the ideas that we hear from the AFD about getting out of the Eurozone, for example? maybe an end to the freedom of movement for people.
Well, the interesting thing is, although this has been termed as a Eurosceptic vote, and they're going to take about 30% of the seats in the parliament, it's important to point out that they span the political spectrum. So you have parties in there who are anti-immigration, but also parties that are anti-austerity. So the thing is that they probably won't be able to work together in the European Parliament. Whether or not there will be a coherent Eurosceptic bloc remains to be seen.
That's a very interesting point. Christine, does that means in a way that any sort of push for change has to come from the status quo in a way, doesn't it? Because there are too many disparate Eurosceptics to forge a common view. What do you think, and indeed where is the leadership for the EU and what might they do?
Well, I think the very positive surprise is Italy, where the Prime Minister, Renzi, with a 40% score, has really smashed down the populist movement in Italy. And obviously, he is the new star, at least on the Social Democrat side in Europe. And he openly, preaches for a more vigorous economic and social policy, less austerity, and I guess that's starting over that dinner in Brussels tonight. He will try and play the tune, and he will be, for Madame Merkel, much more now than François Hollande. I think Renzi will be someone to watch.
Do you, Stefanie, this is interesting, isn't it? If President Hollande is a busted flush, as we might say, is Renzi the man that Merkel might have to do business with?
Yeah, I think she's not really looking forward to meeting him tonight. And Renzi has already said today he will come and say, well, we stop this austerity, this German dictate of saving and consolidation. And he has a very strong backing now because he has his 40% and there's a lot of votes.
But she says what? She can't say yes, can she?
No, but I mean, she, as ever, she just says, well, this is a long process. Let's see what's going to happen. There's so many things we have to have in mind. So it's going to be a typical Merkel summit. Nothing will really come out, but you know that in the back she has already been pulling the strings.
Nina, one of the issues that they've got to decide is who's going to be the next president of the European Commission. I say they, it's going to go to Parliament as well, but let's say this is their decision. What message would be put out, do you think, if, in spite of everything that's happened, they plump for Jean-Claude Juncker, who is, of course, he's been there forever, he's utterly pro-EU, he's pro-Eurozone, he's pro-everything.
Well, this is actually going to be the next big question after these elections. Obviously, the Parliament's backing their candidates, and I think the Council will have something to say about Juncker. Merkel, who I think will have the deciding vote in whether Juncker gets the backing of the EPP or not, has been quite silent on this, and obviously other leaders, including David Cameron, think that Juncker would be exactly the wrong person just because he signifies that status quo, that old-school European pro-integration agenda, which many European leaders, I believe, are now trying to move away from.
Christine Ockrent, can I just ask you about that point? I mean, there is that old phrase from the Second World War here in the UK of keep calm and carry on. And there is a danger here that once all the fuss and bother dies down a little bit, we do still have a situation where the major groupings in the European Parliament are pro-EU, are pro-integration, etc. What do they do?
Well, they carry on, because I don't think that you in Britain and we in France should keep believing that the EU necessarily has to look like us. You know, it's been the great French mistake that Europe would just be France bigger. Most EU countries, again, have voted for the political parties in power, and those political parties are indeed maintaining a line of compromise between austerity on the one hand, trade issues, and free flow of people, which is one of the great assets of the EU. And so I think that we should not be overly influenced by our own national agendas, however turbulent they may have become.
Well, they're all pretty turbulent, Stefanie, and that, in a way, isn't that the biggest problem? The last time we had elections was not long after the financial crisis, and everyone was trying to work a way out of it, let alone express their real views. Now we see what people around the EU think in different countries, and there are too many groups that are too unhappy to feel that there is a common way forward anymore.
Yeah, I also think this keep calm and carry on is not really, it's not possible, and not even for the German government. And you could see Merkel in the week before the elections coming out and saying in a quite tough way, people who come to Germany, EU foreigners who come to Germany just to seek welfare, this is not possible. So she's also taking a tougher stance because she knows that the AfD is a kind of a problem. There's a big potential there, and she needs to keep this under control. And so she has to move forward, and she will, I'm sure, but very quietly. Very quietly.
It's going to be quite a dinner tonight, isn't it? We're going to have to leave it there, but Stefanie Bolzen, Nina Schick and Christine Ockrent, thank you all very much indeed for joining us here on Global.